They appear to draw, then, on their matrix of prior experiences, but unlike in attachment theory, for early childhood, this was a conscious process of analysis they were describing. They also evaluated the demands of situations, and they did thought experiments in which they thought through different courses of action. Why did you learn? I learned because if I did this, this would happen, and that's not me, or that's not acceptable. So they were, kind of playing forward what would happen. So in sum, youth appear to be using their executive suite to analyze the processes at work in these hot emotional episodes. In concluding this topic, then, I want to suggest an alternative to our all too frequent image of the emotionally out-of-control adolescent. These Latino, African American, and Anglo adolescents were thoughtful and engaged in learning to mediate the strange dynamics of emotions in complex real-world situations. They were solving puzzles, integrating their brains maybe, working on an important developmental task, learning the surreal dynamics. Okay, so on to motivation. Our next problem, how do you get youth to sustain motivation to long-term goals? And, the problem of agency leads us to the problem of adolescent boredom. Mid-adolescence is a peak period in the lifespan for boredom. Along with this, school motivation declines in adolescence, accompanied by less interest in challenging tasks. Now, as far as I know, nobody's hypothesized that there's a boredom gene that kicks in adolescence. Maybe somebody has a theory. John Schulenberg is working on this. But to the contrary, there's lots of evidence and research that across the lifespan, that humans of all ages have a built-in system of intrinsic motivation that makes activity self-rewarding. You should always cite your mentor. My mentor, Mike Csikszentmihalyi, found that engagement with meaningful challenges leads to a state of flow, of rapt attention. So think about your best days doing data analysis or writing, when everything is clicking. But whosever theory you're using, this intrinsic motivation can be fragile. Csikszentmihalyi and others conclude that the challenge have to be matched to your skill level. If the challenges are too high, the big question then is how to get this system of intrinsic motivation turned on and sustained for adolescents, particularly in activities with real-world challenges like those they'll face as adults. Now, we know a lot about motivation in adolescence, especially in school, but little on the process of motivational change and development. And again, youth programs are a good place to study this change process. Vani mentioned our Beeper studies, and when we did Beeper studies, these are Z-scores, so the 0 is each person's average score, and you can see that when they were beeped during youth programs, their average challenge was high above 0, as was their average motivation. That's compared to two other major contexts in their lives: school, where they're challenged, but something's missing, or with their friends, they're motivated, but it's not very challenging. Youth programs and TVs, both are down. Youth programs are the one context where those both come together. So motivation is high during youth programs, but not all youth join the program with that high motivation. Some join to be with friends or because their parents told them. My former student, Nikki Pierce Dawes, had the great idea of studying the youth from our research who reported strong upward changes in their motivation. She identified 39 youth who described a marked increase in motivation, then analyzed their accounts of what had happened. And I'm giving you the short version. Now, many Western theories are based on the premise that all motivation comes from core individual psychological drives or needs. We believe in the selfish gene. Well, Nikki found that the 39 youth had 3 different explanations for their motivational change, but only one fit this model. And these youth described a competency experience, and which is a core psychological need in lots of theories of motivation. Many more, however, attributed their change to connecting the activities to their future, often a future career. Marina had joined an FFA program because it was mostly guys. But she said, it's not about the guys anymore. I'm going to be a teacher. This will give me the skills that I need to be a good teacher. It's the things I get out of it right now. Now, some theories of motivation would, define future rewards as extrinsic. It's seen as secondary motivation. It's derived from basic needs. But for these youth, their new motivation was quite personal, authentic, and we think not that easily reducible to individual drives. After all, preparing for the future is a task of adolescence. Few youth get very far with it, and these kids who formed a connection to future goals, it really got their fires lit. The idea that motivation depends only on core individual needs was further challenged by a third type of motivational change, which is most frequent in the 3 activism programs in our study. Now, all 3 were in Chicago, and in all 3, many youth said they joined because the program provided the 40 hours of service which they had to have in order to graduate from high school. So needless to say, they weren't all that motivated when they joined. But let me describe what happened in one program, Youth Action. A main focus of their work, and the youth were Latino and Black youth, was getting the school board to get principals to stop suspending youth for minor infractions like being late for class that were not sanctioned by the district's uniform disciplinary code. And the youth were put to work standing outside schools and surveying kids as they came out. And what they found from their surveys is that suspensions were more frequent, were quite frequent, especially in the schools for African American and Latino students. Now, many members of the program had had a bad experience or two with the schools, but they'd only seen it as a personal experience. As they heard students' stories, however, it hit home that worse things were happening to thousands of students. As a result of their work took on larger and more powerful meaning. They got really motivated. They formed a connection. So Danny from Youth Action recounted how at first I wasn't super interested. When I found out about a lot of the stuff about the schools, what they were doing, I was like, hey, that's wrong, because that had happened to me. He then described getting really psyched, really into it. The third change process fit Bill Damon's concept of acquiring purpose, which he defines as a stable and generalized intention to accomplish something that is once meaningful to the self and of consequence to the world beyond the self. Notice that the motivation involves the self, but the self is not at the center. It's a connection to a cause beyond the self. Damon rejects the idea that purpose can be reduced to core drives. Indeed, cultural psychologist Joan Miller describes how in many cultures, much of people's motivation entails subordination of the self to the group, a point also made by Sandra Graham and Taylor. In sum, for youth in these 2 categories, their process of motivational change was not easily attributable to core needs. I'm not saying that basic needs had no role, but the bigger story, I think, is how motivation was emergent from youth's active, proactive process of meaning-making. It occurred through youth's conscious, constructive process of forming what Nikki called a personal connection. Further, most of these 39 youth described coming to have flow-like experiences. Their work had become fun, exciting, and interesting. The challenges had become intrinsically motivated. The change appeared to unleash or turn on that powerful reward system described by theories of intrinsic motivation. The connection also gave youth the staying power to persevere through real-world obstacles, times when the challenges were low or too high or, things were boring. So the implications then are, the good news is that youth don't need to be motivated when they enter an activity. Motivation can be emergent. The qualification, however, is that adults can't push a button to make them motivated. It depends on youth being proactive, engaging in this process of meaning-making. Okay, let me pause. So, we've got youth learning to manage or to use emotions. We've got them motivated to persevere, but the world is disorderly. How do you reach your goal? How do you cross the river? How do you navigate the complex ecology? If you're the youth, in youth action, how do you convince the Board of Education to make principals